Pratik, an average guy with an average life, whose life turns into a web of confusion and fear, when he realizes he is being taken away by Manish. Not knowing where to and what for. He becomes something he thought would never happen and ends up finding the love of his life, and finally the cost of a mistake. We were staring into each other's eyes, realizing the love we had for each other. I could feel his breath on my lips, they were trembling with joy, and then we kissed, at the end of which both of us were breathless. When the kiss broke, I bent my head and snuggled at his neck. Inhaling his manly fragrance, he easily lifted me into his arms and took me to our bedroom, where the kissing and cuddling continued. He had fallen asleep, pulling me from behind with one hand over my waist, and I was awake wondering how I ended up with such a wonderful man who loved me so dearly. Then I remembered that fateful day when I first saw him. A day I found a few things, but also lost a few as well. I'm an average guy who lives with his parents. I am graduate and have a decent job which is enough for me to take good care of my parents. Being the only son, it was my responsibility to take care of my parents. My name is Pratik and everything was going good in my life. I was like any other typical boy, hanging out with friends and playing games, going on long drives. And life was just normal. One day, when I reached home from my job, there were two huge black cars in front of my house. There were a few bouncers standing at the front gate, and two at the front door of my house. I was shocked to see them and went in fearing if something had happened to my parents. As soon as I reached in, I saw both my parents sitting on the sofa facing a guy who was tall and well built. As soon as I entered the living room, everyone turned to look at me. I could see the worry in the eyes of my parents. Then I turned around to look at the man sitting opposite my parents. He was staring directly at me and looking me up from head to toe. I felt a little uncomfortable with what he was doing, and then I saw his eyes. They had a weird expression in them. It made me feel more uncomfortable, but just as I was about to sit down next to my father, he calmly asked me to go and get changed. So I went into my room and started to change and freshen up. Just as I came out of the washroom, my mother came into my room and asked me to come into the living room. I asked my mother who these people were, and if everything was alright and if she wanted to tell anything to me. She simply replied, "Everything is fine, please come into the living room with me." I followed her into the living room, and as soon as I went into the living room, my father asked me to sit down. I did as instructed, and noticed that the man was still staring at me continuously. I was waiting for my father to say something. After a few minutes, my father simply said, "Pratik, you have to go with Manish." He was pointing to the man, who was still staring at me. I was completely confused and wanted to ask my father why should I go with Manish and what was happening, but before I could ask anything, my father got up and went into his bedroom, taking my mother with him. I was just staring at my parents' bedroom door in shock. A minute later my mother came out with a bag and went into my room. After a while, she came back with the bag, dropped it in front of me and said, "I have put some of your clothes in the bag for you to take it with you. I love you, Pratik," and went back into her room and locking it. I was utterly shocked and was left in the living room with Manish. Then he came up and stood in front of me. He was a tall guy, probably was almost more than 6 feet tall, and I had to lift up my head to look at his face. He was looking down at me with a weird expression. Then he looked at one of his bodyguards and gestured him and went outside. Now there were two bodyguards standing in front of me. One of them simply said, "Sir, please," and gesturing me to the front door, while another guard picked up the bag my mom had left. There was no way I could fight these well-built guards, so I had no other option than to leave with them. As soon as I went out the door, one of the cars was kept open, meaning that I had to sit in that car. Without any other option, I sat in the car and Manish was sitting in the front seat. After the door was closed, Manish gestured for the driver to start. The car had completely blacked out windows. Thus, I could not see anything on the outside, and since the car was a modified one, there was a glass partition between the front and the back seats, which meant that I had no clue where I was going. A million thoughts were running in my head. Who was this Manish? I tried hard to remember if my father had ever mentioned of him, but I couldn't recall anything. What was more confusing was why did my parents tell me to go with him? Where was he taking me? What would he do to me? What was wrong with my parents? I don't know how long I traveled in the car, but I definitely felt like a long time. And after that, we came to a halt and a guard opened my door for me to get down. It was completely dark outside, but I could make out that we were not in the city since there were no buildings as far as I could see and there was no noise from the traffic. I was really scared thinking about what was going to happen with me. I followed Manish into the building that was in front of me. Inside the building, there was a woman standing in the corridor, waiting for us to arrive. She gave a faint smile with no feelings at all. Manish introduced her as Mrs. Sharma and introduced me to her. He turned to me and with a very stern face and said, "I want you to listen and obey everything Mrs. Sharma asks you to do. If you don't, the consequences will be severe for both you and your parents." I was actually terrified by the way he said that, so I just nodded. After that, Manish left the place, leaving me with Mrs. Sharma. She asked me to follow her, and without uttering a word, I did as she said. She guided me through the house, which I realized was quite big and spacious. She stopped near a door and turned towards me and said, "This is your room," and opened the door for me to get in. The room itself was huge, with a sitting area with a coffee table, and a full-length mirror with the big dressing table with spacious wardrobes. It also had a big flat-screen TV, hanging exactly at the opposite side of the queen-sized bed at the center of the room. And there was another door at one corner of the room, which I guessed would be the bathroom. I went to it and opened the door to find a big bathtub at one end, and it also had a shower among other things. It felt like I was in Star Hotel suite. After I had seen the entire bedroom, Mrs. Sharma again asked me to follow her, and this time, she showed me the kitchen and the dining area. Again, both these were very luxurious. Mrs. Sharma then asked me to sit down at the dining table and served me dinner. After I was done, she leads me back to my room and said, if I wanted anything, I could lift up the intercom kept on the bedside table and dial 1, and just walked away without waiting for a reply. I turned off the lights and laid down on the bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering what was happening. Who was this Manish and why had he brought me to this big and luxurious house? What would he do to me? I picked up the telephone on the bedside and tried to call my parents, but I was not able to place a call. And realized just then that I had forgotten my mobile at my home. So there was no way I could call my parents. I just laid down on the bed again and fell asleep staring at the ceiling.